Who can actually afford a $500,000 house in 2026? Not who wants one. Not who feels like they deserve one after years of studying, working, and doing everything they were told was responsible. And not even most people who technically qualify for the mortgage on paper. The uncomfortable truth is that the number of people who can safely afford a $500,000 home without quietly sacrificing their future is far smaller than the number of people being encouraged to buy one. This isn't a moral judgment. It's not a warning. It's simply a math problem that most people never sit down and solve. Imagine a fairly ordinary scenario because that's where most financial mistakes happen. You're not reckless, you're not irresponsible, you're just normal. Maybe you're in your late 20s or 30s. You live in the United States, Germany, the UK, France, or somewhere similar. You have a decent job, not a dream job, but a stable one. You earn what most people would call good money. Perhaps your gross salary is around $90,000 a year in the US or 70,000 euros in Europe. On paper, that sounds like success. 10 years ago, that number felt like wealth. Today, it mostly feels like relief that you're not struggling even if you're not exactly relaxed. After taxes, though, the number changes. In the US, depending on the state, healthcare deductions, and retirement contributions, that $90,000 becomes something closer to $60,000 to $65,000 in actual take-home pay. In many European countries, 70,000 euros quietly turns into 42,000 euros to 45,000 euros after taxes and social contributions. The number that really matters, the one that pays for your life, is already much smaller than the number you tell people at dinner parties. Now let's assume you're doing what society gently nudges you toward. You're renting, but rent keeps rising. Maybe you're paying $2,200 a month in a mid-sized US city or 1,500 euros in a European urban area. You tell yourself that rent is wasted money, and that buying would at least turn those payments into something meaningful. That logic feels sensible, it's repeated constantly. Rent feels temporary, ownership feels permanent. And permanence feels like stability. So you start looking at houses, not mansions, not luxury properties, just something reasonable. A 3-bedroom home in a decent neighborhood, good schools not too far from work. In 2026, in many parts of the US and Europe, that house costs around $500,000, sometimes more, occasionally less, but not by much. The number shocks you at first, but you adapt quickly. Everyone does. When high prices become normal, your brain stops resisting them. You talk to a mortgage broker. They don't ask whether buying this house will quietly dominate the next 30 years of your life. They ask whether you qualify. And qualification is a strangely low bar. With today's lending standards, a household income of $90,000 to $110,000 can often qualify for a $500,000 home, especially if there are two earners involved. The bank runs its ratios, checks your credit score, and tells you the monthly payment is manageable. That word, manageable, is doing a lot of work. Let's say you put down 10%, that's $50,000 upfront. Already, we've lost most people. Saving $50,000 while paying rent, student loans, car payments, and basic living expenses is not easy, but assume you managed it. Maybe through years of discipline, help from family, or both, you now have a $450,000 mortgage. At a 6.5% interest rate, a number that doesn't sound outrageous anymore, your monthly mortgage payment alone is around $2,800. That's before property taxes, insurance, maintenance, or repairs. Add property taxes. In the US, that might be another $500 to $800 a month, depending on the state. In Europe, it varies, but ownership still comes with local taxes, fees, and charges that renters never see. Add insurance. Add a realistic maintenance allowance because roofs, boilers, and plumbing don't care about your budget. Suddenly, your mortgage payment isn't $2,800. It's closer to $3,500 or $3,700 a month. Now compare that number to your take-home pay. If you bring home $5,200 a month after taxes, your house alone consumes around 70% of it. Even in a dual-income household where combined take-home pay might be $8,000 a month, the house quietly absorbs nearly half. And this is where the story usually stops because this is where people say, well, lots of people do it. That's true, lots of people do it. That doesn't mean it's financially healthy. Because the house isn't your only expense, you still need transportation. In the US especially, that usually means a car, not a luxury one, just something reliable, maybe a $450 monthly car payment. Add insurance, add fuel, add maintenance. In Europe it might be public transport, but it's still not free. Then there are student loans, credit cards, groceries that cost 30% more than they did a few years ago, healthcare. Childcare, if that's part of your life or likely to be soon. None of these expenses feel extravagant. That's the problem. This isn't a story about people buying sports cars and designer clothes. It's about people living normal, responsible lives and still running into financial limits they didn't realize were there. The $500,000 house doesn't ruin your finances all at once, it compresses them. It leaves very little room for error. And life, inconveniently, is mostly errors. What makes this especially dangerous is that the system doesn't frame it this way. Mortgage calculators show affordability in isolation. They don't show opportunity cost. They don't show what this house means for your ability to invest, change careers, take time off, start a business, or simply breathe financially. They show whether you can pay, not whether you can live well while paying. Psychologically, this is where things get tricky. Humans are not wired to think in 30-year timelines. We anchor to what we see around us. If everyone you know is buying, buying feels safe. If prices keep rising, waiting feels risky. If your parents bought a home on one income decades ago, you feel like you're behind, even if the economic reality is completely different now. The pressure isn't loud, it's subtle. It shows up in conversations, social media posts, and the quiet fear of being left behind. So when people ask, who can actually afford a $500,000 house in 2026? What they're often really asking is, how far can I stretch before something breaks? And the honest answer is that most people are stretching far more than they realize. Not because they're foolish, but because the math has become detached from the story we still tell ourselves about success, adulthood, and stability. This isn't about discouraging homeownership. It's about understanding it. Because once you slow down and look at the numbers calmly, without shame, without hype, you begin to see that affordability isn't about income alone. It's about margin. And margin is what most people quietly give up when they sign on for a $500,000 house. Let's slow this down and actually sit with the math, because this is where clarity usually replaces emotion. Not excitement, not fear, just clarity. Most people never do this part properly, not because it's difficult but because it's uncomfortable. Numbers don't argue back, they don't reassure you, they simply show you what's there. Assume the same household as before. A single earner making $90,000 in the US or a comparable €70,000 in Europe. After tax, we're working with roughly $5,200 a month in the US or about €3,600 to €3,800 in Europe. If it's a dual-income household, double that, but also remember that dual-income households often come with higher lifestyle costs. More commuting, more convenience spending, higher childcare expenses, and less flexibility when something goes wrong. Two incomes don't automatically mean double the margin. Now let's isolate the house. A $500,000 purchase price, a $50,000 down payment, which is already optimistic for most buyers under 40, a $450,000 mortgage at 6.5% over 30 years. The monthly principal and interest payment alone is around $2,840. Over the life of the loan, you don't pay $450,000. You pay well over $1 million. That's not a trick. That's interest spread out quietly over decades so it doesn't feel real. Add property taxes. In many U.S. states, that's 1% to 1.5% annually. On a $500,000 house, that's $5,000 to $7,500 a year, or roughly $420 to $625 a month. In parts of Europe, the structure is different, but ownership still comes with recurring taxes, fees, and charges that renters never face. Add homeowners insurance, add maintenance. A conservative maintenance rule is 1% of the home's value per year. That's another $5,000 annually, or about $420 a month, and that's an average. Some years cost less, other years cost far more. So now, very calmly, your housing cost isn't $2,840, it's closer to $3,700 a month, sometimes $4,000. This isn't pessimism, this is realism. Houses age, things break, local taxes rise, insurance premiums increase. None of this is rare, it's normal. Now place that number back into your life. If your take-home pay is $5,200, housing consumes around 70 to 75% of it. That's not a budgeting issue, that's a structural imbalance. Even if you cut everything else aggressively, there's no room left for volatility, no buffer for job loss, health issues, family emergencies, or economic downturns. You're not living in the house, you're servicing it. In a dual-income household with $8,000 in take-home pay, housing might consume 45 to 50%. That sounds better, it is better, but it's still tight, especially when you remember that this calculation assumes stable employment, stable interest rates, and no major life changes for 3 decades. That's a strong assumption. Now let's add the expenses that rarely disappear just because you bought a house. Transportation is a big one. In the US, the average car payment is now well over $700 a month for new vehicles, but let's be conservative and say $450. Add insurance at $150, fuel at $200, maintenance at $100. That's $900 a month to simply exist in a car-dependent system. In Europe, it might be lower, but public transport, fuel, parking, and occasional repairs still add up. Then there are student loans. Many professionals in their late 20s and 30s are still paying them. Maybe $300 a month, maybe more. Credit cards don't have to be maxed out to matter. Even a modest $200 payment represents past consumption leaking into the present. Add groceries, add utilities, add healthcare costs, add subscriptions you barely notice because they're only $15 or $20 each. Suddenly, even a disciplined household is spending nearly everything it earns, not on luxury, on life. And this is where the hidden mistake appears, not as a single bad decision but as a pattern. People evaluate affordability using monthly payments in isolation. Can I make this payment? Is a very different question from what does this payment prevent me from doing for the next 20 years? Because here's the quiet cost no one puts on a spreadsheet. When your house absorbs most of your cash flow, you lose optionality. You can't easily invest aggressively. You can't step away from a job you dislike. You can't weather periods of lower income without stress. You can't adapt when the economy shifts. You become financially rigid in a world that rewards flexibility. Psychologically, this rigidity often hides behind pride. Owning a home feels like progress, it feels like adulthood, it feels responsible, so the stress gets reframed as normal. Everyone's tight at first. It'll get easier later. Sometimes that's true, sometimes incomes rise, but sometimes costs rise faster, and sometimes life interrupts the plan. There's also a deeper psychological mechanism at work: normalization. Once you commit to a large fixed expense, your brain adapts to it. You stop questioning it. You optimize everything else around it. Smaller expenses start to feel more painful, not because they're large, but because there's no slack left. This leads to a strange contradiction where someone living in a $500,000 house feels anxious about a $100 unexpected expense. That anxiety isn't about money management, it's about fragility. Over time, this fragility compounds. Retirement contributions get delayed or minimized. Investments feel risky because there's no margin for losses. Emergency funds remain underfunded because every spare dollar feels needed somewhere else. From the outside, it looks like stability. From the inside, it often feels like pressure. This is why asking who can afford a $500,000 house isn't really about income brackets, it's about resilience. The people who can truly afford it are not the ones who barely qualify, they're the ones for whom the house is a small part of their financial picture, not the central pillar holding everything up. They have surplus, they have buffers, they can absorb shocks without panic. Most people don't fail financially because they made one dramatic mistake. They fail quietly, slowly, by locking themselves into fixed costs that leave no room for the unpredictable nature of real life. A $500,000 house in 2026 is often not a reward for financial success. It's a test of financial endurance, and endurance, unlike wealth, doesn't compound. At this point, it would be easy to assume that people who buy houses they can barely afford are simply bad with money. That assumption is comforting because it creates distance. It lets the viewer think, this doesn't apply to me, I'm careful, I'm informed. But that's not how this usually works. In reality, many of the people stretching to afford a $500,000 house in 2026 are intelligent, educated, and financially aware. They can read spreadsheets. They understand interest rates, some of them even work in finance. What drives the decision is not ignorance, it's psychology, layered on top of a system that subtly rewards risk-taking and punishes patience. One of the strongest forces at play is social anchoring. Humans don't evaluate success in absolute terms, we evaluate it relative to the people around us. If your peers are buying homes, upgrading neighborhoods, or talking about property values at dinner, renting starts to feel temporary even if it's financially rational. The pressure is rarely explicit. No one says you're behind. Instead, it shows up in small ways: questions about when you'll buy, comments about throwing money away on rent, casual mentions of equity gains. Over time, these signals accumulate and shape what feels normal. There's also the legacy narrative around homeownership, especially in the US and much of Europe. For decades, buying a home was not just a financial decision, it was a cultural milestone. It represented stability, adulthood, and arrival. That story hasn't been updated to reflect modern price-to-income ratios, higher interest rates, or longer working lives. So people apply old rules to a new economic reality. When the math doesn't work, they don't question the rule, they question themselves. Another powerful factor is the way debt is framed. Mortgage debt is often described as good debt, and in theory, long-term, low-interest leverage on an appreciating asset can be sensible. But theory assumes reasonable entry prices, stable rates, and sufficient cash flow. In practice, labeling debt as good removes a layer of caution. It makes stretching feel responsible. It turns leverage into a virtue rather than a risk that needs to be actively managed. Then there's the fear of missing out, which looks different in housing than it does in markets. Housing FOMO isn't about doubling your money, it's about being locked out. People worry that if they don't buy now, prices will rise further and they'll never catch up. This fear is amplified by recent history where home values rose quickly in many regions. The human brain is very good at extrapolating recent trends indefinitely, even when conditions change. Rising interest rates, slowing demographics, and affordability ceilings don't register emotionally as strongly as past price charts. Loss aversion plays a role here too. Psychologically, the pain of not buying and later seeing prices rise feels worse than the pain of buying and feeling stretched. One pain is hypothetical and future-based. The other is immediate but familiar. Most people choose familiar discomfort over unfamiliar regret, so they buy even when their internal sense of safety shrinks. There's also a subtle identity shift that happens when someone becomes a homeowner. Ownership feels like progress. It confers a sense of legitimacy. Renters, even high-income ones, often feel like they're in a waiting room. This isn't rational, but it's deeply ingrained. When you buy a house, you're not just purchasing shelter, you're purchasing membership in a socially approved category. That psychological reward can outweigh financial concerns, especially when those concerns are abstract and long-term. The system reinforces this behavior. Banks approve loans based on ratios that assume stable income and minimal disruption. Real estate marketing emphasizes monthly payments rather than total cost. Friends and family celebrate the purchase, not the risk. No one throws a party to congratulate you on maintaining liquidity or choosing flexibility. The visible reward is tied to ownership, not to financial resilience. Over time, this creates a dangerous mismatch between intelligence and outcome. Smart people make rational-seeming decisions in an irrational environment. They optimize within a flawed framework. They ask, "How do I make this work?" instead of, "Should this work at all?" Once that question is skipped, everything that follows is just adjustment. The long-term impact of this choice often doesn't show up as a crisis. It shows up as a narrowing of life. Career decisions become constrained. Risk-taking becomes harder. The idea of starting a business, changing fields, or taking time off feels unrealistic, not because it is, but because the fixed costs make it feel reckless. Over decades, this can quietly shape the entire arc of someone's working life. This is why the people who can truly afford a $500,000 house tend to think differently long before they buy one. They don't ask what the bank will lend them. They ask what level of fixed cost preserves their freedom. They don't treat ownership as a milestone to be rushed. They treat it as a tool that must fit into a broader system of flexibility, investment, and margin. They also understand that wealth is not about what you can access today, but about what you don't have to worry about tomorrow. A house that dominates your cash flow may increase your net worth on paper, but it often decreases your sense of agency. And agency, being able to choose, adapt, and respond, is one of the most underrated components of financial intelligence. So when smart people buy houses they can barely afford, it's not because they can't do the math. It's because the math is competing with identity, culture, and fear. And unless those forces are named and examined, they tend to win quietly without ever feeling like a mistake. The real consequences of buying a house you can barely afford don't usually appear in the first year, or even the fifth. In fact, the early years often feel validating. You adapt, you make it work. The payments go out every month, nothing collapses. From the outside, it looks like a success story, and that's exactly why the long-term cost is so often misunderstood. The damage, when it happens, is slow, quiet, and almost invisible while it's unfolding. One of the first things that gets sacrificed is optionality, though most people don't notice it disappearing. Optionality is the ability to say no. No to a job you dislike, no to excessive hours, no to a toxic work environment. When housing consumes most of your income, your tolerance for discomfort at work increases, not because you suddenly became resilient, but because the alternative feels dangerous. Over time, this can trap people in careers they outgrow or never wanted in the first place. This loss of optionality compounds over decades. A person who might have taken a lower paying but higher growth role stays put. Someone who could have retrained or pivoted avoids the risk. The house becomes a silent partner in every decision, always voting for stability over exploration. This isn't inherently wrong, but it has a cost, one that rarely shows up on a balance sheet. Financial fragility also increases. With most cash flow committed, even small disruptions feel large. A temporary job loss, a medical issue, or an unexpected family obligation doesn't require catastrophe to cause stress. It only requires timing. When margins are thin, timing matters more than magnitude. This stress often leads to defensive financial behavior, cutting investments, delaying retirement contributions, or leaning on credit to smooth volatility. Each of these choices feels temporary, but together they shape long-term outcomes. There's also an opportunity cost that's easy to underestimate. Money tied up in a large mortgage is money that isn't being invested elsewhere. Over 30 years, the difference between investing consistently and investing sporadically can be enormous. Compounding doesn't care about intentions, it only responds to time and consistency. A household that maxes out its housing budget often ends up underinvesting during the most important compounding years, not because they don't believe in investing, but because there's nothing left to invest. Emotionally, this can create a strange tension. On paper, net worth might increase as the home appreciates, but day-to-day life feels constrained. This disconnect between perceived wealth and lived experience is one of the most confusing aspects of modern homeownership. You're wealthy in theory but anxious in practice, and because anxiety is normalized, everyone's stressed about money, it rarely gets questioned. As years pass, the house begins to dictate life rhythm. Maintenance projects replace vacations, repairs replace spontaneity. Decisions are filtered through affordability rather than desire. None of this is dramatic enough to trigger regret, but it subtly narrows what feels possible. People often tell themselves it's temporary, that things will loosen up later. Sometimes they do, but sometimes costs rise alongside income, keeping the pressure constant. Contrast this with households that buy well below their maximum. Their housing costs leave room not just for saving but for living. They can invest during downturns instead of pausing. They can absorb shocks without panic. They can make career moves that don't optimize for immediate income. Over decades, these differences compound in ways that are far more powerful than any single real estate gain. This is the core distinction. The financially intelligent don't avoid houses, they avoid fragility. They understand that wealth isn't built by stretching to the limit but by leaving space. Space for error, space for opportunity, space for time to do its work. Buying a $500,000 house in 2026 isn't automatically a mistake, but buying it without margin often is. The cost isn't just interest or taxes, it's the quiet reshaping of your future choices, and that cost, once paid, is very hard to reverse. So after all this math, psychology, and long-term consequence, we come back to the original question: who can actually afford a $500,000 house in 2026? Not emotionally, not socially, not because a bank approved the loan, but in a way that preserves freedom, stability, and long-term financial health. The answer is quieter and less exciting than most people expect. The people who can truly afford that house are those for whom it is not a financial centerpiece. It does not dominate their monthly cash flow. It does not determine their career choices. It does not require constant optimism about the future to justify the present. For them, the house is simply one component in a larger system that already works. In practical terms, this usually means one of a few situations. Either income is significantly higher than average and stable enough that housing remains a modest percentage of take-home pay, or the purchase price is well below what the bank would have allowed. Sometimes both. These buyers don't ask, "What's the nicest house I can get?" They ask, "What level of housing cost keeps my life flexible?" That difference in framing changes everything. They also tend to think in terms of buffers rather than thresholds. Instead of asking whether they can survive the payment, they ask what happens if income drops, expenses rise, or priorities change. They assume disruption, not smooth progression. This isn't pessimism, it's realism informed by experience. Over a 30-year timeline, something will change. The question is whether your financial structure can absorb it. Another quiet difference is how they view progress. They don't see renting as failure or ownership as success. They see both as tools. Renting can be a strategic choice when it preserves capital, mobility, or mental space. Ownership can make sense when it aligns with long-term plans and doesn't crowd out other goals. There's no moral hierarchy, only trade-offs. This neutrality allows them to wait without anxiety and buy without pressure. Psychologically, these individuals are less reactive to social comparison, not immune but less driven by it. They don't anchor their decisions to what peers are doing or what previous generations experienced. They anchor to their own balance sheet and their own tolerance for risk. This often makes them look conservative in the short term. Over time, it tends to make them resilient. They're also more comfortable with the idea that wealth is built quietly, not through dramatic upgrades but through consistency and margin. They understand that a lower housing cost doesn't just save money, it buys time. Time for investments to compound, time to recover from mistakes, time to make choices based on interest rather than necessity. In many cases, this time becomes more valuable than the house itself. When these people do buy a $500,000 house, it rarely feels like a stretch. That's the tell. If a purchase requires constant justification, rates will go down, income will rise, it'll be worth it later, it's probably too large. If it fits comfortably without optimism, it's likely aligned. Comfort here doesn't mean ease, it means margin. This is why the question, "Can I afford this?" is often the wrong one. A better question is, "What does this cost me in flexibility?" because flexibility is what allows financial plans to survive contact with reality. Without it, even good decisions can become fragile. There's no villain in this story, not buyers, not renters, not even the housing market itself. The problem is outdated narratives applied to a changed economy. Incomes haven't kept pace with prices, interest rates have reset, risk has shifted from institutions to individuals, and yet the emotional script around homeownership remains largely the same. Understanding this doesn't require cynicism, it requires honesty. A $500,000 house in 2026 is affordable to fewer people than it appears, and that's okay. Affordability is not a reflection of intelligence, effort, or worth. It's simply a function of math, timing, and structure. If this video has done its job, you don't feel scared or guilty. You feel clearer about what the numbers mean, clearer about what trade-offs actually look like over time, and clearer about the difference between qualifying for something and being able to carry it without strain. If you value this kind of calm, reality-based breakdown focused on understanding rather than selling, consider subscribing, not for predictions or shortcuts but for clarity.